Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
On August 9th, a trainee doctor was found dead at the RG Kaur Medical College and Hospital in Kolkata. She had been raped and murdered. Though a civic police volunteer was arrested soon, the anger has not died down. Allegations of cover-ups and a messed-up investigation refused to go away even after the CBI took over the case and the Supreme Court had a hearing. Every day still sees protest marches in Kolkata. While the marches and bunds called by political parties make the most news nationally, what's also clear is there is a public protest movement happening. There are protest marches called not just by junior doctors who are on strike, but by school students, food bloggers, people with disabilities, chartered accountants, musicians, and many others. Caught on the back foot, the state government has come up with its own program for women's safety. And Mamata Banerjee has said she will launch an agitation for death penalty for rapists. But is the need of the hour really more laws, even stronger laws? And can public protests actually deliver good laws? Or do we need to figure out why so many years after the Vishakha judgment, the Nirbhaya agitation, the Posh law, we are still where we are today when it comes to women and safety? Today we are joined by two guests who have had years of experience in this area. Jhuma Sen is an advocate at the Calcutta High Court and the Supreme Court, and is adjunct faculty at the National University of Juridical Sciences in Kolkata. She has a focus on gender justice. Amrita Dasgupta is executive director of Swayam, a feminist organization working to end discrimination and violence against women and girls. Jhuma Sen, Amrita Dasgupta, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to first start by saying that crimes against women are unfortunately not at all uncommon. And both of your work is deeply involved in the issue. Do you remember what your first reaction was when you heard about the RG Kaur case? Did it feel different in any way?
Thank you, Sandip. This is Amrita. I think the initial reaction, like everybody else, was a state of shock or a disbelief. But as things unfolded, there were so many layers to it, and there still is. But personally, for me, for somebody working in the violence against women sector for about 25 years, for me, the core of the issue continues to be kind of women's safety and violence against women. So it's a larger issue, but for each one of us who's kind of engaging in the larger debate, whether it's a movement or a debate, I think each of us have a different take on it and a different kind of connection to the issue. So on one hand, yes, it's shocking, it's appalling, it's gruesome, but we all also know that this is not an uncommon incident. Maybe the severity might have been different, the location, we can debate about that, but generally violence against women has been on the rise. There's been a lot more reporting recently after this incident. This is what happens. This is a cycle that happens when newspapers all talk about what are the different incidences. And on average, I was going through it, about 25 to 30 cases, really extreme cases of rape or gang rape and murder has been reported in the press. So reported doesn't mean that these are the only cases that are there. So I think we also need to see it in the larger framework of violence against women that is operating not just in India, but it's a global phenomena.
Jhuma?
Apart from the sort of the shock factor to this, my first instinct was I thought about the infamous 1992 gang rape case of a Dalit woman that eventually led to Vishakha in 97. And I was just thinking that 27 years ago, the Supreme Court gave us Vishakha. In fact, we gave us Vishakha. It was largely a women's movement-led initiative before the Supreme Court. And we had the Vishakha guidelines, very historic guidelines, which was later inscribed into the statute, that is the 2013 Sexual Harassment Act, commonly known as POSH. So my sense, I would say, was one of complete desolation. I didn't know how to respond. It is, because we hear and we read and we see these events unfold before our eyes over and over again. But the more things change, as it appears, the more they remain the same. We gave ourselves the Justice Verma Committee report in the aftermath of the Nirbhaya case. And it was again a very brutal kind of specter that haunted the mass psyche until 2012, 2013. And the state was forced to set up a committee, somewhat narrow, as you know. Its mandate was actually to look at criminal laws pertaining to sexual violence and to recommend changes. But then the committee engaged in a very, very consultative process, and it gave us the Verma Committee, and we had a kind of a rainbow spectrum of possible recommendations that could change our lives a little for the better. Today, I heard that the Chief Minister has promised a bill for death penalty for rape in the state. But that goes so far beyond what was suggested, what was recommended by the Verma Committee. And it suggested a holistic overall kind of change in all sectors, not just the workplace as a sector, but in all sectors and segments of our life, starting from school education, starting from making those changes, those pushes at the very societal level, to sort of taking it beyond to the courtroom, to our investigation, to our courts, and to other areas. But then you see the response that came, as events unfolded, as you hear that the offense was not registered. It took time to register an FIR, and the FIR was not registered by the hospital. They waited for the parents to register an FIR. So that then brings us to, again, another question that, what has changed? Because the moment that the law says that the moment there is the reporting of a cognizable offense, then FIR must be registered. And
can I ask you something at this point, Jhuma,
sure.
Which is, right, it requires that the FIR should be registered right away. But the question is, what are the consequences for not doing that?
Anyone can report a cognizable offense before the police, and it is the job of the investigating officer to record it, to register it as a first information report. It is fairly simple, and there was a dead body found at the hospital under questionable circumstances. The first thing that ought to have happened was for the principal, and this is the principal of a public hospital, of a government hospital. So he is a public officer. By any stretch of definition, he is a public officer. He was mandated under the law to inform that. He should have informed that. He did not bring it to the notice of the authorities for whatever reason. But the official version is, as can be discerned from the court proceedings and the court coverage, is that initially this was registered as an UD, as an unnatural death. Then that is how the process is. First, you register as an unnatural death, and then you do the postmortem, and then you register an FIR. The submission has been, as it has been also reported by the large section of the media, that the FIR was registered at the behest of the victim's family. It could have just been placed before the victim's family that we are happy and fine to file an FIR, register an FIR, and you can come with us. We will go and inform the police and ask for the registration of an FIR to take place. But that was not done. But what I think needs to be called out very loud is that there is admittedly, and from a look at things, there has been admittedly a lack of accountability. A lack of accountability on the part of the hospital authorities. And this is something which is subject of investigation. I'm not going to go into it. But there was clearly also a lack of accountability on the part of the investigation in the manner in which it was handled by the police. So that is one part of it. But even other than that, there are other issues to be considered as well. For example, that, the institution also has a role to play in providing a safe and secure workplace for its employees. The victim here was a postgraduate trainee doctor, and she was very much an employee at the workplace. And the onus is cast on the employer to maintain a workplace that is safe and secure. And when I talk about safety and security, I'm not just talking about CCTV. Because I do not think CCTV is the beginning and end of providing safety and security for working women.
Let me also just bring Amrita in and ask her, given all these issues that Jhuma is laying out, as you know, Amrita, very well, that even now, more than 2 weeks after the actual incident, every day there is a protest march. Leave the politics aside. Their school students have been protesting. There have been protest marches by people with disabilities, food bloggers, all kinds of people. Has this atrocity, and your experience as an activist, hit people differently?
On one hand, obviously, it's difficult to call anything positive under this current climate, but definitely there is something positive in a people's movement. And Most of us have now seen so many people come onto the streets, as you're rightly saying, and it's people from different walks of life. I've even seen a group of chefs who are doing their march. I think we need to give credit where it's due. However, like I said earlier, each of us are on the streets for different reasons, and there is a different politics behind it. On one hand, is it making a difference? And I think there's a lot of opinion and there's a lot of conversations happening behind the scene, as in your and my WhatsApp groups, in our family groups, in our school groups, which is also quite interesting because it's actually telling a story that, it's not making a difference. What is the point? They're just people marching. But for me, at least people are marching. And if you use the word activist to define me, and that is a belief and a day job as well. So often a lot of issues about violence against women is down to people who are working in a social sector who are activists, who are raising their voice and are kind of protesting and, you taking their placards on the streets. But violence against women or safety for women, on one hand, is not a women's issue. It is a social issue and it impacts each one of us. So until we realize that the difference that we have to make is not down to NGOs and activists, and is down to each one of us, the chefs who are working in a restaurant or the school students who are studying in school, because ultimately we are talking about safety and equality. It impacts each one of us. So until we have a change in mindset and a ownership, that is down to each one of us, because often we are sitting here and talking about what has gone wrong and the gaps in practices, which is all very important to analyze and discuss. But somewhere we also need to take onus and individual accountability. And I think that angle is still missing because we are still on a rage, understandably so. However, I think somewhere we need to do some deep dive into ourselves, into our society, into our families, into our individual selves, because we are all contributing to the society. These individuals who are behaving or are being abusive or violent or raping somebody, they're not coming from outer space. They come from your and my family. I think somewhere there isn't enough conversation about prevention. There isn't any conversation about acknowledgement, about the socialization process that creates these men.
Because the conversation is more about the retribution, justice, the identifying the culprit. So it's how to deal with the incident after it has happened rather than preventing it.
But we need to talk about prevention because these are not random incidences. There are many more such incidences that's happening. These are the tip of the iceberg that we are hearing about. I mean, here we are talking about a rape or a gruesome rape, but there's domestic violence and women are not safe in their own homes. Sexual violence is on the rise in public spaces. Sexual harassment at workplace, which is obviously linked to this incident. We have seen a huge increase in cases of sexual harassment at workplace. As Jhuma rightly said, that the Act has been in place. The Act has been in place exactly 10 years in 2023. And yet we know that there is very little work that has gone around implementation of it. And the more women who are entering workspaces, there is a backlash and there is a challenge. And we are seeing a lot more cases of sexual harassment at workplace being reported. So I think somewhere it's a larger conversation and we all have a role to play in that larger conversation.
And do you think that it's actually harder to have that larger conversation, Amrita, because the very gruesomeness of this particular case, in a way, lets people, men especially, think that, well, I wouldn't do something like that. And so it allows them to distance themselves from it. I remember I was part of one of these marches and these men were watching and they said, they should just take that guy and leave them to us. We would show them, how to really deal with it, which was a way very much about that was done by others, not us. We are not part of the problem.
I think it's interesting you brought it up because we were having a conversation at our workspace because we work with men and boys as well. And I think somewhere we are not talking to the men and boys because somewhere we need to talk to them about what they're feeling, what the impact is on them. And it's a mixed feeling. And I think there are many more men out there who are feeling ashamed. They're feeling embarrassed about being a man under the current climate. There's a lot of them that are feeling pressurized and cornered because everybody's looking at them as potential rapists is what they're saying. So on one hand, it's not all men who are violent and not all men are abusive. And we need to call that out. But on the other hand, most women have been abused by a man. So I think somewhere we need to look at the larger statistics and talk about there is this movement, couple of organizations and globally about bystander interventions, because not all men, is one issue. But like you rightly said, the gruesomeness of this incident has made a lot of men feel like I'm not that. I'm not the guy who's beating up my wife in the house. I'm not that guy because I wouldn't go and do this. So somewhere there is a sense of superiority. When such serious incidences happen, we have seen something called copycat behavior, or turning this incident into a kind of I don't know if I want to even use the word slang. So there's this term that's going around saying "arji kor kore debo." So that is, a lot of my colleagues have heard this in the metro.
Which I'll translate as, for those who don't speak Bangla,
Yeah.
Well, I'll do an RG core on you.
Yeah, so I will do the same incident on you if you act smart, or if you speak up, if you try and challenge me in the metro, this is what I'll do to you. So there is also a backlash that we need to be aware of. And somewhere we need to go back to talking about larger socialization process that creates these systems. And I think somewhere the minute we talk about socialization process, we are pointing our finger at ourselves. And most people are not comfortable doing that. We are all very, very good at giving long lectures and a lot of opinion about what needs to change in other people's homes and in the state and in the legal systems. But are we talking about our own homes? Because somewhere over the years, I am more and more conscious that this needs to be a social issue that we talk about in schools and colleges at a much younger age, about gender equality and about a kind of a discriminatory society that we are all growing up in. So it is not just the incident that is gruesome. It is the reaction of the people is also gruesome. And I think...
In fact, we also did see reports about the huge spike in Google and internet searches on people looking to see if there were videos of the incident somehow floating out there. So, which is not something people would admit to. But having talked about that, let's talk a bit about some of the measures that have been put in place to try and deal with this issue. And Jhuma was brought up both the Verma Commission and Vishakha. So let me start with the Verma Commission, Jhuma. What were the main changes that the Verma Commission proposed, and which of those changes were actually accepted?
It's an answer which is very difficult to provide, because the Verma Commission report was a very, very comprehensive report. And I think the beauty of the report was that it came up in a very consultative fashion, and women's groups and others, everyone participated in the process of giving ourselves the Verma Commission report. Now, like I said, that while the initial agenda of the report was to look at criminal laws related to sexual violence and suggest changes, etc., changes in terms of, punishment mostly, that was a very limited mandate that was provided. But the commission engaged in a far wider consultative process, both in terms of the spirit of, to creating a society which is very inclusive for all, and also to look at all laws in a very holistic sense. So I think the most radical changes that it brought in was with reference to rape law, in the sense that it widened the definition of rape. It provided a definition of consent. And these were some of the changes which were incorporated by the state in the criminal law amendment that came up in 2013. But there were also several other changes that also introduced some certain other offenses, new offenses, voyeurism, stalking, and so on and so forth. And there was already a long-standing demand from feminist groups for a very long time to have some of these definitions incorporated in the language of the law, because the reality of these incidents existed without having sort of a legal definitions. The language that unfortunately seems to revolve around the language of security. Security is fine, but security is a very limited aspect of a woman or any vulnerable group who tries to access her workplace, with the dignity that she deserves. And I was looking at the Verma Committee report, and I found that there was one entire chapter devoted to safety and security as well. And even that was quite comprehensive. I'm not a great propounder of these technocratic responses to law, but even back then it suggested having some sort of a helpline number, although we know that these helpline numbers do not work. Because most of the time, if you call the helpline number, no one is available, or they will essentially ask you to come to the Thana to register a complaint, which is not really useful. But I think one of the things about the Verma Committee report, not just Verma Committee, but if you actually look at Vishakha, and if you look at the entire spectrum of all these reports, practice directives, guidelines, and laws, and so on and so forth, everything that has come, there has been a part of it, either acknowledged or not, which has spoken about the preventive measures that as a society we can give ourselves. So those preventive measures, while they are part of your various statutes, various directives, various laws, various guidelines, those are for reasons best known to institutions. And when I talk about institution, I'm also keeping the state in its ambit of the definition of institution. These are not implemented. So why are they not implemented? I think that is a question that needs to be asked. So, for example, the investigating agency, which can be a police, which can be a CBI, which can be, whosoever, but let's say a police, the investigating officer, the investigating agency is supposed to conduct an investigation in a proper manner. The investigating officer is supposed to be sensitized, gender sensitized. The investigating officer, in reality, we see are seldom gender sensitized. And, if a survivor of sexual violence tries to go to a Thana and tries to register a complaint, she will not be immediately attended to. There is a process, the language is called burking. She will be asked to go, she will be asked to come again another day, she will be asked to show proof, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that all police and all Thanas, all police stations are doing this, but this is a very common practice in the sense that there is a verifiable amount of public accounts about the trauma, the double victimization that survivors face.
Can I just stop you there, Jhuma, and say, that in a way is what also spurred the anger that led to Vishakha, because the woman in that question was literally asked to leave her skirt at the police station because it was evidence, and she had to go home wrapped in her husband's shawl or something like that. It was as terrible as that.
Yes, it is. So not just Vishak, you have the Mathura case. This was way back in 1970s. It brought into action what we know today as the women's movement. I'm not saying that the women's movement or the women's groups did not exist earlier. They did. But the 70s was a phenomenal period. And you had Mathura. And in Mathura, what happened was that it was a case of custodial violence. So the entire conversation around sexual violence also it wrapped itself around the conversation of custodial violence by police. We are talking about, sexual violence which takes place in custody of a police station, and the Law Commission submitted its report and all that happened and the law was amended. But the home, for example, when we are thinking about the home is also a form of custody. So what are we doing in recognizing sexual violence that takes place not by strangers, by acquaintances, by people we know? The marital rape still continues to exist in the statute, the marital rape exemption, the spousal rape protection, that still continues to exist in a statute, despite the Verma Committee suggesting and recommending its removal. Tomorrow, if you start having a conversation about a removal of the marital rape exemption, many of us, and I want to say that many of our friends, acquaintances, colleagues who are now going out in the public arena demanding justice for the victim of RG Court will probably come back. They will probably not attend such rallies because that...
And certainly no politician will ask for capital punishment for rapists.
Because this incident, this conversation that has sort of not just emerged, it has erupted from this incident, the article, it is about stranger rape, allegedly stranger rape. We do not know. It could be acquaintance rape. It has not happened in the confines of the home. It has not happened in the confines of home by someone who is a member, who is someone who is supposed to love and care and nurture us and protect us. I'm using, protect within air quotes. But you see the vocabulary of justice also, I think, needs some kind of articulation. We want justice. It's a very easy demand to be made. But when we are thinking in very functional terms, what does justice mean? Justice for the victim, for the victim's family member may mean a punishment. I'm even willing to concede that it may even mean retribution. I'm not going to judge whether their demand for a retributive justice is right or wrong. But the manner in which justice is translating, the vocabulary of justice is translating in the public arena, there is a large-scale demand for retributive justice. And like I was saying earlier, that now the state has promised, I read newspaper reports, the chief minister has stated that she's going to bring a law in the assembly preferring a capital punishment for rape convicts. So that to me is a knee-jerk response, and as if to suggest that a law is a very easy, quick fix for all your problems. It's seen as a panacea. During Mathura, there was a public outrage and outcry. And at that point of time, I would say that there was a need for a certain recognition of certain offenses. But now I think we have enough laws. I don't think we need more laws. And I don't even think that a stricter sentence is going to cure all problems. It never does. It never has, because a stricter sentence also means, in very plain legal term, and I'm wearing my lawyer's hat here now, if you have a higher sentence, it means lesser conviction. because the standard of
The bar is raised.
Yes, and in a country like ours where investigation is generally very shoddy and most convictions in any, even what would have been otherwise convictions, most trials, they result in acquittals. So in such a scenario, instead of doing the hard work of training all the stakeholders, so instead of doing that hard work of training, of sensitizing, of training, of learning, collectively learning that what leads to such offenses, such crimes, because criminals are not coming from Mars. They are very much part of a society.
Which is what Amrita was also saying. So in that sense, Amrita, would you say that despite all these years of laws, these commissions, these reports, do you feel like when you look back at the Nirbhaya case or Unnao, has the conversation within ourselves, within homes, shifted at all? Or are we still in that old sort of victim blaming and all of those things that had been par for the course whenever cases like this come up?
Difficult question, but I think somewhere when we talk about social change, when we look at violence against women, we are looking at a patriarchal society. We're looking at changing in mindsets, which has been there for hundreds of years. So things take a long time. On one hand, definitely there is change. That is why we are even having this conversation. We all are here. However, when any kind of social change, you take 2 steps forward, you might be taking 3 steps backward. And I think globally, we have seen increased a kind of backlash against women's movement or kind of rights-based movement. And this is a global phenomenon, not just in India. And I think somewhere we are seeing a lot more women speaking up, being articulate, being empowered, kind of claiming their rights. And there is a certain degree of backlash because each of them is kind of claiming their own independence and in their own space in a different way. On the other hand, we have seen through work a lot of change in newer forms of violence. So on one hand, for example, Jhuma spoke about domestic violence, which maybe 15, even 20 years ago, people would not talk about it openly. Today, because of the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, which is going to complete 20 years next year in 2025, there is a lot of investment that has gone into implementation. I think that is what we also need to talk about. So there is a recognition that domestic violence is there and it's happening within the, the close relationships or within the home. But however, there are other newer forms of violence, and POSH being one of them, which is sexual harassment at workplaces in the rise. We are not talking about something called natal family violence, which is when your parents are being abusive, which has always been there. But I think COVID showed kind of the gruesomeness of parents controlling and manipulating the children in the name of love and parenting. And we are not ready to talk about it. We are not talking about cybercrime, which is really on the increase, with India being one of the higher pornographic users in the world. And we don't talk about sex, we don't have sex. So somewhere, until we acknowledge that sex is the normal, healthy thing which two human beings will do, and we talk about sex education and we talk about consent and boundary, we are then creating a society where you might not have enough food to eat, but you have access to a smartphone and unlimited access to pornography, which gives you a very distorted view of the world and about relationships, sex, and intimacy. On the other hand, I think there is some shift when we talk about prevention, and Jhuma also talked about ownership is down to families, it's down to schools, it's also down to the media, the social media, films, everything. So everybody will say, it's not my problem. I'm a creative soul. I'm just making a movie. Or I am writing a fiction. It has nothing to do with anything. But somewhere we all contribute towards the larger picture about what is acceptable. And we do live in a society where we are motivated and kind of moved by what we see around us, by our role models who are our film stars and movie stars, all of them.
When you say like 20 years of the Domestic Violence Law Act have had a certain impact in at least bringing that conversation out.
Yeah.
In that sense, would you say, 10 years of the POSH Act and Vishaka been around, has it contributed to making the workplace any safer? I mean, even RG Kaur had a committee against the sexual harassment of women in place, and obviously that did not prevent this horrible event from happening.
There are definitely flaws. Many of us who are in committees, many of us like Jhuma who are practicing in court, definitely there are flaws, but it hasn't been implemented properly. And I think somewhere we need to first focus on implementation, then talk about creating something totally new. And I think there are gaps because on one hand, complaining about a senior in a workplace where your pay and your future and your kind of career growth depends on it is a very problematic thing to do. However, saying that, there are some committees which are going above and beyond and trying to make a difference in their workspaces, but it is very far in between. And it has become a token exercise where you have a committee which is written in somebody's book, like committee that was there in RG Court. The Act clearly talks about that nobody in senior positions can be in the committee, and the chair of the committee is a senior woman in a senior positions. None of those were followed. The POSH Act it talks a lot about prevention and sensitization. It doesn't, most acts talk about when the incident has happened. This kind of act talks about sensitization and prevention and creating a safe place, even to a point of putting phone numbers out there, making all employees know who the committee is and where to go for support and where to go for help. So in a way, it is positive. It is very clearly stating it out. But if organizations do not implement it, where does the kind of authority come in terms of holding us accountable for those gaps? Somewhere a lot more money and investment and resources should have been done for the POSH Act, which hasn't happened.
Let me put that to Jhuma and say, is the issue here that the POSH Act, despite its, if the problem is with implementation, is the real problem also about accountability? If you don't follow what the POSH Act says, are you in fact, can you be held accountable for it? I mean, would someone come to RG Court now and say, how could you have a committee that about this against sexual harassment of women and have the principal Sandip Ghosh as a member or head of that committee? Should there be consequences for that?
It's a very interesting question that you've asked. Ever since I heard about, I came to know about this RG Court incident, I have been thinking a lot about institutional accountability or the lack of institutional accountability. So one, when Vishaka happened, if you just go back to the very beginning, to the inception, what Vishaka and the 2013 Act did, it gave a structure within which you could address, very systematic issues of workplace discrimination, which were based on gender. But those discrimination, there was a sexual harassment. If there was an issue of sexual harassment at workplace, you at least on paper, theoretically, you know that there was a structure that existed which you could access for getting some sort of redress. But it also, both Vishaka and the 2013 Act largely, and in fact, if you look at the title of the 2013 Act, it is not just about redressal, it is also about prohibition, it is also about protection. So while the law talks about sexual harassment, the sexual harassment occurs in a spectrum. It can range from anything between voyeurism to anything which becomes an IPC offense, and where like rape, where the committee then is supposed to assist the woman in filing a complaint before the police. So sexual harassment is also a range, it is also a spectrum. But the preventive aspect of the law is something which is completely, it is not taken seriously. That is a question of lack of political will. And this is my minor grouse with Vishaka, although Vishaka as well as the Act, is that it seemingly, it is not actually, but it seemingly it gave the employer an impression that the state, and this is who is giving this impression is given by the state. The state seemingly takes, kind of a backstage. It asks the employer, it asks the institutions to set up their own monitoring mechanism. This is how it is being interpreted, but this is actually not the correct interpretation. The correct interpretation is that if you look at the essence and the spirit of Vishaka as well as the 2013 Act, the POSH Act, there is very much a presence of the state in the manner in which there is an annual audit kind of thing. Although that annual audit is very generic, you just have to submit numbers, how many cases you have dealt with and how many cases you have disposed and so on and so forth. And there is no mechanism to monitor whether that audit is taking place properly. In fact, last year, the Supreme Court, in a judgment, Aureliano Fernandez has asked Supreme Court for this, these issues were brought before the court that in spite of so many years, you had Vishaka, you had the 2013 Act, now it's been the 10 years of 2013 Act, and in spite of that, actively there has been no monitoring of how the law is functioning, and there is no information about the prevention or the prohibition part of the law. It has all become about redressal, and even the redressal part is not taking place properly. Why? So if in a system where in the RG Court, if the two senior administrators, the principal as well as the MSVP, the medical super cum vice principal, these are administrative post holders. These two individuals should not have been part of the IC. Now, if you give a benefit of doubt, let's say that they did not know, the IC did not know, they were made part of the IC. Who was supposed to bring this to the attention of the chair? the external member was the person who was supposed to bring this to the attention of the chair, because the external member, everyone in the IC is supposed to have training and they are supposed to have some experience working on these gender issues. But the external member specifically is someone who is supposed to have, who ought to have an expertise in this field. The external member should have brought this to the notice of the chair that these two, that the IC must be reconstituted. The principal and the MSVP have no business in being part of the IC. Maybe this was brought before the chair and the chair did not take any action. We don't know. But this is one part of the law not working, and the other part is the LCs, the local complaints committees. Over 90% of our workforce, of our female workforce, they belong to the informal economy. Your domestic worker, your workers in the bidi industry, your workers in the construction industry, your daily wage laborers, they are all part of a large informal economy. That is the largest sector where women work. For the informal sector, mostly, the response is in the nature of a local committee, local complaints committee. The local committee is directly monitored by the state, where the district magistrate has a role to play there. But do we know, is there a way, do we have any sort of audit, any sort of understanding, any sort of stock taking, whether the district magistrate is doing its job?
So when we bring up the issue of the state, let me ask Amrita this. The state here, West Bengal, quickly came up with a proposal called Ratire Shati. The goal is to provide safe working space for women, prevent these things from happening. That came in for a fair amount of debate and discussion. How would you grade the proposals that were put out by the state there, Amrita?
In terms of any kind of action plan, it should be done in a consultative way. And somewhere the consultation did not take place. Whether it's youth groups or women's groups should have been consulted before this kind of a plan set in place or kind of plan floated. So somewhere asking women not to have night shifts or to not give night shifts to women, or if we're asking women to quickly go back at home in the evening because it's unsafe, is actually defeating the purpose. We are taking 10 steps backwards by making those statements like that. Somewhere, again, it's the same thing about we are not addressing the problem. We are going into protectionist mode. And a lot of our traditions and a lot of our cultures is about protection, whether it's Rakhi or whether it's a lot of the cultural practices or the religious practices we have. It's women need protection and women don't actually need protection. Women need equality, women need respect. So we are going back in time by asking women who are educated, employable women to say, no, we will not do night shift. Instead, we need to talk about why is that workplace unsafe? Why are the roads unsafe? And again, as Jhuma rightly said, CCTV is ticking a box. CCTV doesn't mean that we are sorting all the problems of the world. We need to talk about accountability, whether it's state accountability, organizational accountability. So, for example, company A, why will it not take into account about safety of women, even if they are working night shifts? Why will it then kind of reduce women to short shifts? Because we don't want to take responsibility for keeping women safe. It's an incident that has happened in my workplace where a male staff has shared that he is so traumatized by this incident. He has stopped his daughter from working because his daughter used to come home late at 10 o'clock and he is very worried about her safety. And he has asked her to quit her job and she has. This is what is going to happen everywhere. And we have heard about this colleague at workplace. There are so many more men who are putting restrictions and taboos and control over their women, all in the name of protection and safety.
And how do you deal with that even in your workplace, Amrita? Because I think with the best of intentions for many of these men, it's really hard to wrap their minds around the idea of what you just put forward, that the daughter does not need protection, but needs equal access to the public space.
I think it's conversations after conversations that we need to keep having. Even at our workplace, we realize that despite doing this work for 29 years, there is still a lot more conversation. So there is a difference between program staff and non-program staff. And we realize that there is a gap between understanding in our non-program staff who are not in the field working on violence against women as a day job. Onus is on me to ensure those conversations happen in my workplace repeatedly, so that at some point, the man who is stopping his daughter from going into work will slowly realize that I need to empower my daughter, talk about safety. And again, there's this new culture of safety, which is taekwondo, karate, and pepper spray. So that again is problematic. So I think somewhere, yes, we need to look at safety ourselves, but safety not from a point of view that I will start attacking everybody that's walking past me. So I think somewhere it's a balance, and maybe the balance also has to come from school. And when we talk about various state legislations or changes, it could be a mandate that is passed in schools that talk about gender sensitization, consent and boundary, and sex education. Not the sex education of frogs and other reptiles, but genuinely sex education, talking about what it is. There is an age for it, but somewhere there is so much taboo around the word sex, and there is no conversations in our families and in our schools about consent and boundary. For me, I feel that consent and boundary is crucial to any conversation on violence and discrimination. It starts at a very young age in our schools, even as young as class 1 and 2, when 7 and 8-year-old kids are bullying each other, pushing each other around, discriminating against each other for the tiffin they are bringing or the kinds of action or the families they come from.
Let me ask Jhuma, would some of this taboo nature of these subjects become a little easier to have a conversation if, say, we were really able to talk about something like male rape, which has now vanished from the Bharatiya Nyaya Sangvidhan because all the rape laws assume the victim has to be a woman, because we don't really even acknowledge the fact that men can be raped. This sort of vulnerability that is needed to have this conversation is often missing.
No, I completely agree with you. We need to have conversation around masculinity in our feminist spaces. The thing is, feminists are talking about it, but the larger public space, I don't think is really talking about it. Like there are expectations of womanly behavior, a womanly conduct, or their expectations to be a perfect victim. When we are talking about a perfect woman, or perfect womanly conduct, we also tend to think of a perfect manly conduct. In common parlance, that translates to a woman is supposed to be the housewife, the man is supposed to be the breadwinner, and the woman cannot have any aspiration apart from being a homemaker, and a man cannot have any aspiration other than being a breadwinner, which again translates to a man who wants to be a stay-at-home dad or a stay-at-home husband, for example, wants to be the homemaker, wants to take care of the home, because taking care of the home is work. It's major work. It is a work it's a labor that is completely invisibilized, and it is completely erased in a language of economics. But that work, that labor is an unacknowledged labor. And if a man or if a husband, if a father wants to be at home, wants to take care of the household, then that is something that should be welcome. In the same breath that a woman who's going out, who's stepping out of the home, the conventional sense, the home, and going out and working in a 9-to-5 job. So this conversation is extremely important to be had, not just in our public culture, in our public sphere, but also at our home. So a boy who wants to wear pink, or a boy who wants to cry or who cries because he's hurt, because he's feeling vulnerable, must not be shut down.
Or told not to behave like a girl.
Yes, not to be like a girl. So I saw in yesterday's protest, and the internet is all over news, protesters said that churi pore boshe thakun or something, like churi pehen ke baithe ho.
Wearing bangles and sitting, yeah.
Yes, so you're wearing bangles. Who wears bangles and sits? The assumption is that women are wearing bangles and sitting. So women do not take action. They do not lead. The irony is that women are the ones who are leading this. What is the threshold of manliness? What is the threshold of womanliness? There is no perfect woman. There is no perfect man. There are perfect expectations.
Does this mean that the more we get into this issue, that old sort of stereotype of what men are from Mars, women are from Venus holds true? Because so many of these conversations keep seeming to happen at such cross purposes. Amrita?
I think it's not black and white, and it'll be unfair to kind of go back to the age-old book that was published. But I think somewhere we have come a long way. We do have feminist men out there. But as Jhuma rightly talked about it, in the sector, when we talk about socialization process and gender equality, we are still really trying to bring up macho men or macho boys. And there is so little space for difference. And I think somewhere we as a society are growing up in very, very tight box definitions of whether gender, class, caste, religion, everything. So if you don't fit the box, you don't fit it at all. So I think somewhere we again need to go back to larger definitions, and a man, woman, or any other gender, it's a spectrum. How can you define somebody by 2, 4, or 5 characteristics? I also want to talk about another point in this incident, because it is also what not only the gruesomeness of the incident, but it's because a rape took place, whether a gang rape or a rape, debatable. I can't comment on it. And I think somewhere that culture has to be also called out. We are still living in a society where rape is used as a threat, as a weapon. We have seen it being used as a weapon during wars, whether during our partition, whether they're in World War II, whether in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Ukraine, everywhere, a woman's body is used during war to teach her community, her family, her country a lesson. And somewhere, until we break that cycle of using women's bodies as weapons during wars and conflicts, we as a society have not progressed much. And I'm really thinking of Kamladi a lot now, because Kamladi had this quote that she used to talk about, that
It's Kamla Basin.
Yeah, Kamla Bhasin, that a woman's honor doesn't lie in her vagina. And somewhere when a woman is assaulted, whether she's physically hit or whether a rape takes place, it's an assault, full stop. Why are we grading rape or sexual assault in a very different connotation? And why does she become impure? And why is there so much shame and taboo linked to that? And women have grown up for generations with that if somebody touches me, I become impure. If somebody rapes me, it is my fault, or I become dirty. And somewhere the onus needs to be put back on the perpetrator and not on the person receiving or facing that incident. So I think it's a culture that we are living in, a culture where rape threats are given as conversations during political parties, in meetings, amongst friends. So I think somewhere this conversation for me is also the rape culture. The rape culture, which is very prevalent in our society, in our films, in our kind of colloquial. We use it very, very casually. And we also do it. That's another conversation. Absolutely.
Well, that's another conversation, and it's a huge conversation. But since we talked so much about laws and implementation, do you have any suggestions for any concrete measures that can come out of this horrible event that happened that might actually help to provide for more workplace, and I'm using the word dignity, not just safety?
Well, there are several, and thank you for asking this question, because I think some of us have been talking about this quite a bit. At the very outset, we need to understand that where we stand. In order to understand where we stand in terms of our laws and in terms of our workplace and all that, we need to do a gender audit to find out what is wrong, what has gone wrong. We need to do this across the board, across institutions, all public institutions, all private institutions. And it has to be, so it is my belief that we ourselves, we will figure out, we will understand that what are the kind of findings, that will be placed before us. What are the kind of recommendations then that such findings can provide, can kind of, guide us. So before having that sort of a gender audit, nothing is possible. But since you asked me about a concrete recommendation, what could happen apart from a gender audit, like I say, law is too important to be left to lawyers alone. So there has to be a community response. There has to be some sort of an ombudsperson kind of structure. We need to think about how that structure will work, whether there has to be, some sort of a Mahila Lokpal, but we know how our Lokpals also work. So, it's not always a foolproof system, but there has to be some sort of an external monitoring mechanism that periodically audits. And when I say audit, I don't mean that just sending like a report, an annual audit with 3-liner of information that this is the number of cases that we have received, this is the number of cases that we have disposed, and this is the number of trainings that we have done. I know how trainings happen before the audit is supposed to take place, the report is supposed to go, and I get calls, that we have to submit the report. Can you come and do a gender sensitization course or a course on sexual harassment and law for our IC members? This conversation around sexual harassment at workplace, unfortunately, has become too much about compliance. The institutions see POSH as a compliance is something that you need to do just to, is as a tick mark against the box kind of mechanism. So you have an IC, okay, fine, we have an IC. Whenever there is a complaint comes, the IC will sit. But most of the times complaints do not come because the potential complainants do not even know. They are not even aware that an IC exists. There is no monitoring mechanism to ensure that they know about this. I'm very certain about it that we need to have a gender audit. In fact, I mentioned about that the Supreme Court judgment earlier as well, that Aureliano Fernandez, there was an instruction by the Supreme Court on all the state and the UT administrations to submit a report, essentially about, what they have done, what steps have they taken, essentially asking the respective state governments to do some sort of an audit. An audit cannot be just numbers. These are the number of cases we have got, and these are the number of cases we have disposed. It has to be something more substantial.
We'll have to leave it at that, Jhuma. But before I let you go, Amrita, is there anything you would add to these ideas that Jhuma put forward in terms of concrete steps forward?
No, I think somewhere I've talked about this before. It's about our own. Obviously, we are all talking about state accountability. We are talking about implementation of the law, but we also need to look at ourselves, our families, our homes, our schools, our education system, and we need to hold each other responsible and accountable. And somewhere when we stop talking about this as a women's issue and an NGO issue, and we look at it as a social issue where each of us have a stake in it and a benefit from having a safe and equal society, it's only then we will come collectively to create this social change.
Amrita Dasgupta, Jhuma Sen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jhuma Sen is an advocate at the Calcutta High Court and the Supreme Court, and adjunct faculty at the National University of Juridical Sciences in Kolkata. She has a focus on gender justice. Amrita Dasgupta is Executive Director of Swayam, a feminist organization working to end discrimination and violence against women and girls. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargav and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.